All right, welcome everyone. Um, we don't have too many live streamers right now, and that's totally fine. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have some people join us shortly. So, I would love to take some time to introduce myself. My name is Brittny. I'm a content and instruction expert here at Magoosh. I do have a bachelor's of science in nuclear medicine from Old Dominion University and two master's degrees of business administration and healthcare administration degree from Georgia State University. I do live and work in the great Atlanta, Georgia. So, very happy to be here. And I have quite a bit of experience in tutoring as well as GRE, GMAT, SAT, and ACT prep. So, I'm glad to be here to be able to talk to you guys today about GMAT Critical Reasoning. So, what we want to start with is looking at the CR argument passages and how they have three main components. So, one of the components is the premise. And the premise or premises, you can have more than one, are the facts or reasons that form the foundation of your argument within the critical reasoning passage. From there, you have the conclusion, which is the message that's supported by the premise, as well as sometimes you may have some assumptions. These are things that are usually not stated in the argument, but have to be true in order for the conclusion to be valid. Without it, you'll have some disconnects, some gaps that are taking place. So essentially, what you have is the background or context, which is basically giving you information about the background. This is exactly what it says there. You have your premise, which we talked about, are the facts of the passage, and then your usually unstated assumptions. And all together, if you look at this in kind of a mathematical way, that all leads to your conclusion. Keep in mind that they may not come in this same exact order. Okay, so they can appear in this order, or you may not have any part of this at all. So it just really depends. So let's talk about your CR process when you're looking at how to attack the question, how to attack the passage. In order, you have to determine the question type, break down the argument, predict, and then do process of elimination. Sometimes you may hear me call this POE. But we're going to start with breaking down the argument because you really need to understand what the argument is saying before you can really go through and determine the question type and predict and go on from there. So let's start from a lesson and foundation standpoint from breaking down the argument. All right, let's look at a really, really simple argument. I love animals. All my pets are birds. JJ is my bird. Therefore, JJ is a bird. This makes logical sense, right? Because if all of my pets are birds and JJ is my bird, that must mean that JJ is a bird because I don't have any other pets other than birds. So this argument is very valid and makes sense. In a valid argument, the conclusions are necessarily true 100% of the time. Okay, so the premises logically lead to the conclusion every single time. And most arguments, unfortunately, are flawed. And that's where we come into the question, right? So if you had an argument and it was always true, then you wouldn't have really any question to generate there, right? So we know that most of our CR arguments are flawed. That means that the conclusion is not necessarily true 100% of the time. It could be true 99% of the time, but that 1% is what you're looking to exploit. So that is the disconnect. We call it the disconnect. There's a disconnect between the premise and the conclusion, and we're identifying what that disconnect is. So let's go back to our original argument here. All right, it says, all my pets are birds. JJ is my pet. Therefore, JJ is a bird. Is that true? Is that a valid argument? All my pets are birds. JJ is my pet. Therefore, JJ is a bird. I would think so, right? Same thing we just talked about in our previous example. But let's look at this one. All my pets are cats. Roz is a cat. Therefore, Roz is my pet. Think about that for just a moment. Is that a valid argument? Well, if we were to say it was a valid argument, that would mean that I own all of the cats in the whole wide world, right? So Roz doesn't have to necessarily be my cat or my pet. He could be Susan's pet, my best friend's pet, right? So this is a flawed argument. And these are the types of arguments, again, in a very simplified way, that you will see on your critical reading or critical reasoning sections. Your job is to find the disconnect between your premises here, your conclusion here, and then you do something with that disconnect. Let's look at another example. All of my pets are birds. JJ is not my pet. Therefore, JJ is not a bird. Again, this assumes I own every bird in America, in the world, in the universe, right? Not possible. So again, this is a flawed conclusion. However, all of my pets are birds. JJ is not a bird. Therefore, JJ is not my pet is a valid argument, because if all I have is birds and JJ is not a bird, then JJ is not my pet. So hopefully you guys are seeing a trend here where what we're looking at is the argument, and if it flows logically, if it's true 100% of the time, and if so, it's a valid argument. But if we can come up with a part of the argument that's flawed, a part of the argument that makes it untrue, or a time or instance where that argument is untrue, then that argument is flawed. There's a disconnect. And that's what you're taking advantage of when you're looking at the critical reasoning questions. So, as we said, the goal is to find the disconnect. Keep in mind that most CR questions revolve around finding that flaw we talked about, or that disconnect between the premise and the conclusion and argument. And you want to be on the lookout for some common flaws. We'll talk about that in just a second. And I wanted to put a note here, and it's kind of premature because when you're looking at this, when you're looking at the flaws that you find, the next step that you're going to do is look at your answer choices to determine which one of those either remedy the flaw, make the flaw worse, depending on the question type. And I'm foreshadowing something we're going to talk about later on in the lesson. But one thing that's a really easy trap to fall into is when you see definite words. So in your answer choices, if you see stuff like never, always, most, majority, very, anything that's on the extreme or have or definite words, you want to look out for those, because again, it has to be true 100% of the time. So if you're seeing these definite words in your answer choices, you have to be able to support it with your conclusion. So just be careful of those. That's a common mistake that I see students make. They see the argument, they agree with it, but they don't realize that it's too extreme of an answer choice because it has those definite words in there. Okay, so that's just kind of like a peekaboo, a preview of some tips and things that I see that I think students should be very careful and look out for. All right, let's look at some common flaws that you're going to see, some common disconnects between premises and conclusions. So, the four top flaws that you'll see, number one is precision in language flaws or change in terms. This basically means that the premise will say one thing and the conclusion will say something that's just slightly different to throw you off. So here's an example. School A has higher scores on the SAT than school B. Therefore, school A students must be smarter. All right. So you can try to draw that conclusion, but that may not be true, right? So this is when your brain, your wheels turn and you start thinking about, okay, well, are there circumstances where that may not be true? Well, the SAT may not be a gauge of whether someone else is smart or not. You could even look at maybe there's a scandal going on and teachers are giving students the answer to the SAT at school A versus school B, right? Things like that. Those are holes that you can poke in the argument that show that it's not always true. So this is a precision in language flaw. Generalization is another flaw. It's a type of precision in language flaw, which is basically assuming that something is true in one case, or just because it is true in one case, that it's also true in another case. So here's another example. At 90, my grandmother drinks soda every day and is still in good health. Therefore, the elderly can have a soda each day and remain healthy. So we're assuming that just because my grandmother drinks soda and is healthy, that every elderly person can drink soda and still remain healthy. That may not be the choice, the truth, right? So again, poking holes in that theory. What are some other explanations for why grandma might be healthy? It could be her genetics. It could be that she's drinking unsweetened soda. It could just be luck of the draw, right? So we can't generalize and assume that just because something is true for one person or one thing or one scenario, that it's also going to be globally true for all other scenarios. This is a generalization flaw. All right, the next one we have is correlation. And this is assuming an association. You may have heard correlation does not imply causation. That's something that I learned in school in getting my MHA and MBA. Basically, it's an association between A and B, and assuming that because A and B have an association, that A caused B. Okay, which we know may not always be true. Here's an example. Most graduates of school A get engineering jobs. Clearly, the reputation of the school gets them their positions. So we're assuming that just because students from this particular school get jobs in engineering, that the reputation of the school is why they get that particular job. Now that may be true, but there are other options for why these students may get engineering jobs. Maybe a lot of the alumni have engineering jobs and they send their children to this school A, and because their parents are engineers, they get a job. Or maybe there's a huge engineering firm that just hires these students out of the school. Or maybe this is the only college in the school or in the city. Maybe it's a small town and there's a big huge engineering firm there. Maybe the students here are particularly interested in engineering. It may have nothing to do with the school's reputation, right? So there are other options for why this may be the case, and that's poking the hole or determining what those disconnects are. Last but not least, we have our statistical flaws, which is basically interpreting valid statistics in an invalid way. So here's one. School A provides financial support to 60% of its students, and School B gives financial aid only to 30% of its students. So clearly, twice as many students of College A receive financial aid. All right, we may assume that that's true because 30% times 2 is 60%. But that may not be the case, right? School A may have less students than School B. School B may have more students than School A. So 60% of different numbers, 60 and 30% of different school numbers, right, would generate different levels of students, right, or different number of students receiving financial aid. So this would be a statistical flaw. Okay, so those are the four main ones that you're going to see on the GMAT. So now that we've talked a little bit about breaking down the argument, right, and we focus on the different types of arguments you'll see, as well as the different types of flaws that you'll see, let's talk briefly about determining the question type. So there are four major question types that you're going to see on the GMAT. The first one is weaken. The second one is strengthen. The third one is inference, and the fourth one is structure. Now, keep in mind, guys, that this is just talking to specifically the four major types. These aren't the only types, and that's an important distinction because there are other question types that you might see on the test, okay? So I don't want you all to think that just because These are the four major types. These are the only types, but they make up a majority of the types of questions that you're going to see on the on the GMAT. Okay. So most of them are going to be strengthening, as you can see, approximately 50%. The second level that you'll see is weakening. And then you have inference and you have structure. So let's talk about what each of these major types look like. When you see these question types or a type of question that's a weakening question, it's going to ask you to find the flaw and make it worse. Typically, you're going to see negative language in the question stem. So it'll say, how can, or something about something being worse or something being, worse is a good one. Just negative words in the language that tells you, okay, I'm looking to make my conclusion worse. Okay. What this means is, if you think about it, if you have a premise and you have your conclusion, right, and you identify the flaw, okay, this is the flaw. Let's go back to the example where, let's go back to this 90, this one right here. My grandmother's 90, she drinks soda and is in good health. Therefore, the elderly can have a soda each day and remain healthy. So we identified a flaw here, right? It's a generalization flaw. We've assumed that just because grandma drinks soda, that everyone can drink soda and remain healthy. So a weakening question type would cause you to take this disconnect that we've identified between our premise and our conclusion and make it worse. Something that, if we're true and our answer choices would say, oh, yeah, now this flaw is really, really bad. We can definitely identify that this is untrue. Okay. A strengthening question is going to tell you to find the flaw and make it better. Okay. So going back to our example about the grandmother who's drinking soda every day, we see that flaw. There's a disconnect. There's a generalization. We're assuming that older people can drink soda every day and still remain healthy, right? So now we're looking for information that would make that true. All right. Now, that's not the best example because we know that's not going to be true, right? But we're looking for information in our answer choices that say, okay, this bridges the gap. Another way you can think of it is, if you have a chair, you have the seat of the chair and you have the legs of the chair, right? Imagine that you have no glue or no screws, no nails or anything between that chair. That's the disconnect, right? With strengthening questions, we're looking for the screws. We're looking for the nails. We're looking for the glue to hold that chair together, to say, we identified that there was no glue between the chair. Now we're looking to identify how we make the chair stronger, how we bridge that gap, right? With weakening questions, we want to say, we're going to kick that chair straight over. Now we know for a fact, we're proving that there is no connection between the seat of the chair and the legs of the chair. Not sure if that makes any sense. Sometimes that helps students understand kind of as a analogy what we're looking for here with strengthening and weakening. And this is going to be an 80% of the questions that you see on your test are going to fall into one of these two categories. All right, inference questions are probably the most difficult, in my opinion, on the test that you'll see. But the good news is less than 10% of your questions, or about 10% of your questions, are going to be inference questions. And they're going to ask you to draw valid conclusions from the premise. So your argument will contain the premise, but there'll be no conclusion. And it's going to say, what is something that must be true 100% of the time in this situation? And you'll have to identify that. So it's a lot different than your weakening and strengthening questions. And if you take a Magoosh lesson or do our GMAT lessons, you'll really dive into how to approach these inference questions, okay? So I highly, highly recommend that if you're struggling through inference, weakening, strengthening, or any part of critical reasoning, or really any part of GMAT. All right, last but not least, you have your structure questions. These questions will basically have you break down the argument and then identify the different components of the argument. Okay, so again, very, very different here. The question will typically have a structure. It'll have like this is one part of the question. This is the second part of the question. It's very structured in its language. And then the arguments will contain premises and conclusions. And you'll have to identify what are the premises, what are the conclusions, or you may have to identify what that disconnect is. So it's kind of taking the approach for weakening and strengthening as far as the question structure and flipping it around. So instead of giving you what the premise and conclusion and you're finding the disconnect there, it's kind of flipping it around and you're identifying that. Okay, so again, structured questions are a little less than 10% of the types of questions that you're going to see on test day. So you don't have to worry too much about those. If you're looking to kind of get your biggest bang for buck when it comes to where to focus your attention for types of questions that you'll see on the critical reasoning section of the GMAT, I would really focus on strengthening and weakening. Okay, these are going to be about, again, 80%. So most of your questions are going to fall into these two categories. And keep in mind, these aren't all the categories, again, like I said, that you're going to see. There are a few other question types that you might see on the GMAT. So just keep that in mind, but wanted to hit on these four major ones so that you can kind of get a feel for the types of questions that you'll see and what kind of questions that you'll be asked in order to figure out how to approach those specific questions. Okay. Not seeing any questions here, so we're going to keep it moving. All right, so we talked about the CR process, right? The first thing you do is determine the question type. We talked about that second because I really wanted to establish how to break down the argument. You can't really look at the question type until you know at least the argument, at least when you're learning this process, okay? But when you're approaching the question, the very first thing you want to do is determine the question type, which is going to be probably, more than likely, one of the four we just talked about, but again, could be a different one. All right. Once you determine, oh, this is this type of question, now you know how to approach it. And the next step is going to be to break down your argument. So we talked about those common flaws, the generalization flaw, the precision in language flaw, statistical flaws, correlation flaws. Those were our major ones we kind of went over. Are common ones. So we want to read through the question and we want to say, oh, this is this type of flaw and this is the disconnect, right? We're going to identify the disconnect. When we're breaking down the argument, we're looking at the premise, we're identifying the conclusion, and then we're finding what is our disconnect. From there, probably the most important step here is to predict, okay? And what predicting does is it keeps you from falling for the traps. Okay, these test writers are very, very tricky, right? So they're always going to give you very tempting answer choices that may have you fall victim to choosing an answer choice that is incorrect but looks tempting to choose. Okay, so it's your job to predict before you peek, is what I call it. And so what I mean by that is you're going to look at your passage, you're going to find that disconnect, and you're going to label it. You're going to say, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for an answer choice that makes this specific disconnect either more true or fixes the disconnect or it widens the gap. It makes the prediction or the disconnect worse, right? Those are the strengthening and weakening question types we talked about. Or if you're looking for an inference question, right? If we go back to our slide here, if you're looking for an inference question, your argument is going to have the premise but no conclusion. So you're going to be saying, what is something that makes this true 100% of the time, right? With your structure, you're going to say, okay, I need to identify the premise or conclusion, or I need to identify the disconnect, depending on, again, what the question asks you for. That's why you have to look at the question type first, right? So really this prediction process is an investigation. This is where you're taking some time, you're going through, you're saying, okay, what could this answer be? Now, even a vague prediction can help, right? Your prediction doesn't have to be spot on and exactly what you would see in your question or your answer choices, But what this does is it helps you shy away from those trap answers and really focus in and hone in on what you're looking for. And we'll see an example of that in a second. So once you develop your prediction and you know, okay, this is what I'm looking for going into my looking at my answer choices, then you can do a process of elimination where you go through your answer choices and you eliminate anything that doesn't match your prediction. Okay, keeping in mind that if you have a vague prediction, you may have to be a little bit lenient on that, right? But ultimately, once you get really good at predicting and you really focus in and you get some practice on that, I think you'll find that a lot of the times using that prediction as your process of elimination tool will really help you find the correct answer. And again, avoid falling for those trap answer choices. Okay, so determine the question type, break down the argument, predict, and then last but not least, use your process of elimination. All right, let's look at some examples to walk through. All right, so remember our first step is to determine the question type. So I'm not even going to read this right now. I'm just going to look at my question. And it says, all of the following cast doubt on the conclusion of the argument except. So this is kind of a weird language one, right? Because I said that weakening questions would give you negative language. So it says cast doubt. So the first thing you might think is, oh, I want to weaken the argument. But then you see the word except, right? So here we're really not weakening the argument. We want to know which one of our answer choices do not hurt our conclusion, right? Which one does not hurt the conclusion. So while this is maybe kind of an in-between strengthening question, right? So we're not necessarily strengthening it, but we're definitely not weakening it. We want to find one that does not hurt our conclusion at all. So we're going to take a strengthening approach just because that's probably going to be the best way to approach this question. So remember, this is our question stem, and we've determined our question type. All right, now let's look at our passage here. I'm going to pause just in case there's some people who are live that want to read this to themselves for a bit. I know sometimes I learn a little better when I'm able to read something to myself. So I'm going to give everyone a few minutes, or not a few minutes, a few seconds to skim through this, read it on your own. If you're watching this as a recording, please feel free to pause the recording and just take some time to read over this question prompt, and then we'll read it, or this passage here, and then we'll read it together. Okay, so let's read this together. It says, the waters off the coast of Iceland are filled with pods of killer whales, which migrate there during the summer. Wildlife parks that rely on the killer whales for entertainment hunt the killer whales almost exclusively in the water of Iceland. Because strict sanctions forbid them from doing so off the coast of North America, an area also abundant in killer whales. Since Iceland recently gave in to pressure from international groups opposed to the hunting of killer whales, it too will forbid the hunting of killer whales off its coast. Therefore, all wildlife parks will be forced to end their shows featuring killer whales once their current killer whales are unable to perform. So here's our conclusion here, right? Therefore, all wild parks will be forced to end their shows featuring killer whales once their current killer whales are unable to perform. All right, so our argument states that the only place wildlife parks can find killer whales is off the coast of Iceland. Yet with an imminent ban there, right, wildlife parks will be unable to replenish those respective in-park killer populations. So what we want to do is eliminate all answers that call this into question, right? So we're essentially saying we do not want to hurt this argument. We want it to remain that we believe that all wildlife parks will be forced to end their shows, right? So any argument that would correct that, right, would be wrong. So let's look at our answer choices again, highlighting our conclusion. All right, let's look at answer choice A. The recent ban only extends to within 100 miles of Iceland, though killer whales are plentiful along the shorelines or shores of Greenland, which fall outside this range. All right, what is the problem with this answer choice? Again, feel free if you're watching this as a recording to pause and feel free to read through these answer choices on your own and see what you come up with, and then we can go over them together. But the problem with answer choice A is it provides a source of killer whales, right? It tells us, oh, they can find killer whales off the shores of Greenland, right? So since it gives us a source, it weakens our argument that there is no source. So we have to rule out answer choice A. That's not right. Let's look at B. The incoming Prime Minister of Canada, who is more conservative, is planning on lifting the ban on hunting killer whales off the coast of Canada. All right, so this argument says that states that North America is also abundant in killer whales, right, in Canada. So or our argument here, right, so off the coast of North America, it tells us that, right? So if Canada lifts its ban, then that gives us another resource to get killer whales. Again, this weakens our argument that there is no resource and we're going to be unable to perform. So B is wrong. All right, let's look at C. Provides a great, or 1, 2, 3. There we go. In part, killer whales births have become increasingly common, especially in those wildlife parks that harbor a large number of killer whales. Okay, so this gives us a way to replenish the killer whale population, right? It tells us in the park itself, they're having a lot of babies, a lot of whale births. Again, this would attack our argument or weaken our argument that we don't have a source. So C is wrong. D, some wildlife parks are involved in illegal trade of killer whales. All right, so this means, maybe through illegal trade, we can get additional whales, additional killer whales. Again, hopefully you guys are seeing the trend here. That's going to weaken our argument that we're going to have to end our performance, right? That we're going to not have a source of killer whales. This gives us an option for another source. So it doesn't work. Last but not least, right? So we've ruled out A, B, C, and D. I think process of elimination here, which is one of our 4 steps, would tell you that E is the answer, but let's look at why. It's nearly impossible to catch killer whales in deep waters. So hunters typically rely on luring whales into coves. All right, so this does not provide a new way for us to acquire killer whales. It talks about how they're caught, right? But it doesn't tell us how or tell us anything that would weaken or that would fix our problem as it relates to not having enough killer whale population and ultimately being unable to perform. So of our answer choices, this is the only one that doesn't weaken our conclusion, right? Okay, so E is the correct answer choice here. Okay, answer choice E. All right, I'm gonna pause and look in the chat and see if we have any questions. Doesn't look like we do. If you do have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm happy to come back to this question to review. But assuming that we're all good, I'm gonna keep it moving. All right, let's go to our next example question. So remember, our first step is to determine the question type. It says, which of the following most logically completes the argument above? So we are completing the argument, meaning there is no conclusion. We're looking to find that conclusion, right? We're looking to pull in the conclusion from our answer choices. So that really helps me out because that means I'm looking at premise. I'm looking at the premise and the information, the facts and the reasonings given within the passage. And then I'm going to take that information and I'm going to look for the correct conclusion that is 100% of the time true in order to complete a logical and sound argument. All right, so let's read this together. Again, going to give any of you who are live a few seconds to read this on your own, or at least skim through it and get an idea on your own. If you're watching this as a recording, again, please feel free to pause, and we'll talk about it in just a second. All right. Let's read this one together now. While antibiotics have done an estimable good to humankind over the last 70 years, there are several drawbacks to using antibiotics that, until recently, have been overlooked. The human microbiome, which consists of the trillions of bacteria that reside in each person's body, is essential to good health. Specifically, the body contains and requires both good and bad bacteria. It is when the proper equilibrium between the good and the bad bacteria is disrupted that a number of health issues can emerge. Nonetheless, antibiotics indiscriminately kill both good and bad bacteria. So each course of antibiotics should be followed by a treatment that blanks. All right, let's think about this, right? Let's kind of re-summarize. So we learn here that antibiotics kill both good and bad, but that we need both good and bad bacteria in order to kind of have that balance. So we don't want to negate what antibiotics do. We can't say we want to just get rid of antibiotics altogether. That wouldn't be helpful, right? But we do want to maintain that equilibrium. So if we're taking antibiotics that kill the good and the bad, then we need to have a treatment that ultimately makes the good and bad come back, right? That brings back this equilibrium here. So ultimately, we're looking for a course. So each course of antibiotics should be followed by a treatment that I would predict brings back the equilibrium between good and bad bacteria. Okay, hopefully that makes sense if you think through it. All right, so let's look at our answer choices again. We've done our, we looked at our question type, we've broken down our argument, we've predicted, and now we do process of elimination. Okay, answer choice A, bypasses the microbiome altogether. Well, this is wrong because a treatment that bypasses the microbiome doesn't really deal with the initial problem, right? The potential imbalance between the good and bad bacteria. All right, so that doesn't work. All right. Answer choice B, it's tempting. It says targets and eliminates only the bad bacteria. That's tempting, right? Like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. Okay, we want to eliminate the bad. So, or we want to, have a treatment that eliminates the bad bacteria. However, you have to be careful. And this is why it's so good to predict, right? Because if I was just looking at these answer choices, I would immediately be drawn to B because we want to target and eliminate bad bacteria. It makes logical sense. I would select B and move on. The problem is, what does our passage say? It says that the good and the bad are essential to the body, right here, right? The body contains and requires both good and bad bacteria. So if we just eliminate, if we just eliminate the bad, then that doesn't really address what our passage tells us. It tells us that we need a balance, right? One that doesn't upset or throw off the balance of or the course of the antibiotics. So again, not only does it not match our prediction, which we said was to maintain the equilibrium, but it negates our passage and what the information given to us in the passage says. All right, so this is an important point of, again, why it's so good to predict. I would, without even looking at this, I'd say, nope, that does not match my prediction. It cannot be right. Let's look at C. Restores the correct balance between the good and bad bacteria. All right, this is exactly what we predicted, right? We said that we thought that we wanted a treatment that would bring back the equilibrium, restore the correct balance, right? Not the same exact words, but it means exactly the same thing. So we could just select C and move on. But just in case C wasn't as intuitive for everyone, especially those of you who are joining us through the recording, I want to look at why D and E are wrong, okay? D says purges the body of remaining antibiotics. So remember, it's not that the antibiotics are the problem, right? It's a disruption of the good and bad bacteria. So this does not fit the mold for a treatment. Because we said, again, antibiotics have done good to mankind. So we don't want to purge them. Last but not least, completely reverses any effects from the antibiotics, kind of for the same reason, right? As D, this is wrong too. The point is taking the antibiotics is to undo. What would be the point of taking it if you're just going to undo the effects, right? So remember here it says, so each course of antibiotics should be followed by a treatment that reverses it. That kind of wouldn't. Why would we take it in the first place? Right? So you can look at it logically through that. You can look at the fact that it does not match our prediction. And then for the same reasons, again, purging the antibiotics. Well, antibiotics, are actually good for you. It just throws off that equilibrium. So we need to make sure that we maintain that equilibrium. So again, that's why E is wrong. Lots of reasons why E is wrong. So C is our correct answer. We can select that answer and we can move on. All right, so those are two example GMAT questions I had for you guys. Wanted to pause again for anyone who's live to see if I see any questions in the chat. I do not see any questions in the chat right now. So I'm going to assume everyone feels good about the information we covered today, feels good about the examples that we talked about today. But just in case, feel free to drop some questions in the chat while we do a quick takeaway. So remember, step by step, if you follow these 4 steps for your critical reasoning, there really is no reason why you won't do well on your critical reasoning section. Just as a quick kind of, caveat, or I want to give a nod to the fact that it's not easy. Okay, guys, when you start using these principles and kind of going through it, I know I make it look like on screen, oh, that's so easy. It's easy when you're working through it with someone else. But I want to acknowledge that it's not super easy. Sometimes you have to go through and you have to really take your time looking at the questions and really breaking it down. What a lot of students struggle with is time management, right? So when you're breaking down the argument, sometimes you only have a minute or two, less than that, to really go through, look at the argument, do your prediction, process of elimination, and then find your answer choice and move on. I want to acknowledge that, okay? I want to give a nod to that. I know it's difficult, but the key thing is practice, right? So you have to practice. And the more you practice with this method, the better you're going to get at doing it. So even if it slows you down in the beginning, even if you're just kind of exhausted over using this specific method, it is a foolproof method. So once you get used to it, it'll come quickly to you. And so you have to do something slow at first in order to get to the point where you feel better about it, to where you get a little quicker doing it. Okay. So just don't give up on the method. That's what I want to say. A lot of students do. They get frustrated, they give up, they just start panicking and just going through the questions without a process. And I guarantee you that that's the wrong way to go. All right. So with that said, determine the question type before reading the argument like we did. We said, what kind of question is this? What are we looking to do? You want to watch out for those subtypes that we talked about in our question types. Then you want to break down the argument. You want to look for that premise. You want to look for your conclusion, unless it's an inference question like what we just had, right? So you want to look for that conclusion if you have one. And then from there, break down your argument. From there, you want to do your predict before reading the answer choices. Remember to trust yourself. Trust your prediction over the test maker. The test maker is there to trick you. So don't fall for the trap. And last but not least, use your process of elimination or your POE based on that prediction. So watch out for that strong versus weak language. Remember to negate any assumptions that are made, anything that's outside of the context of the passage, any information that goes beyond the passage. Again, watching out for those words like never, always, most. Those are things you have to prove. It has to be all the time 100% never, all the time 100% always. And if it's not, then it is not the correct answer choice. Okay? If you follow these steps, if you get used to them, if you really kind of hone in on this process, I promise that critical reasoning will get easier as the day goes on. I see a question here, so I'm going to stop and pause to answer that question. 1 second, let me read it. Here's our question. I'm planning to do my master's in the US, so I wanted to take up Magoosh GMAT Prep Premium course. Oh, great. As I'm not able to make payment for my card and PayPal, is there any way? Okay, this is a personal question. Yeah, yes, I'm going to take your question down. I'm sorry, I probably should have read it before, but that's totally fine. We do have some payment options. I know that we do. So I'm going to refer you to help@magoosh.com. That's going to help@magoosh.com. That'll send to you. There you go. All right. And I'm going to also reveal it for everyone else. If you have any questions like this about payments, any interest you may have in taking Magoosh classes, help@magoosh.com is going to be a fantastic resource to help you out there. It's not just a call center. There are real life people like me who man our email and who make sure to answer your questions, any questions you may have about Magoosh. So as it relates to payments, we do have a lot of students who are outside of the US. I'm sure there's ways for you to make a payment. I don't know right off what those ways are, but help@magoosh.com is going to be a great resource for you. And if you email them, Mr. Reddy or Mrs. Reddy, they will get back to you. I'm 100% sure they will. Okay, so help@magoosh.com. And I'm so glad we have a student who's in here who wants to take our Magoosh resources. I'm telling you guys, they're engaging classes. I teach a couple of them. Not sure if you guys liked my class today. I know it was brief, but I teach a few of them. We have some other really great instructors who teach classes for us as well. And so these are really great resources out there for you. If you're not interested in taking a live class, that's okay. We also have prep that's available for you. So you can go through at your own pace. You can watch pre-recorded lessons. If you're a really busy person, you just can't commit to a specific time. So you can go in and you can just take these courses on your own with videos that are engaging, practice questions. let's say that you've taken the GMAT, or you're not sure what you want to do, but you want to take some admission courses. We have that too. So again, if you're applying to a school in the U.S. From outside of the U.S., or even if you are already in the U.S. and you're applying for a school here, we have admission resources that are fantastic. They will review your statement of purpose for you. They will help you navigate the admissions process for your school. So lots and lots of resources that are there to support you from a perspective of admissions as well as test prep. Magoosh is it, guys. I promise you. So go to our website, magoosh.com. To get some more information about our classes and lessons that we have to offer, as well as our admission resources that we have to offer. And I hope you guys found today to be helpful. If there's no more questions, I'm going to end our live session today right on time, well, with 5 minutes to spare. But hopefully this was helpful, and I hope to see you guys in another class or wherever I see you. Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.